Richard Buckland confessed to a murder he did not commit. He was 17 years old, sitting in an interrogation room. August 1986. The forensic tools available to the institution processing him belonged to a different era. The test that would have walked him out of that room in 24 hours had been published 8 months earlier in one of the most respected scientific journals on Earth. No one in that building had read it. The laboratory that could have freed him was 20 miles north. 20 miles. 8 months. That is the distance between a false confession and the truth. On the morning of November 22nd, 1983, a police officer walking the black pad footpath found a school bag before he found the body. It belonged to Lynda Mann. She was 15. She had walked across the village the previous evening and never came home. What forensic science could do in November 1983 was establish a biological trace. The result? Blood group A, PGM 1+ secretor. That profile narrowed the depositor to roughly 10% of British men, approximately 2.5 million strangers. The trace was real, but the signature was a crowd. What forensic science could not do was extract a unique pattern from that trace. The molecular biology required to identify an individual existed only in scattered fragments, engine parts sitting on a workshop floor before anyone had assembled them. No published paper, no validated method, no laboratory anywhere in the world doing what would soon be done in Leicester. By the summer of 1984, the Lynda Mann investigation was effectively dormant. Her mother released a statement describing a happy teenage girl with her whole life ahead of her. The absence left behind was total. Alec John Jeffreys was 34 years old on September 10th, 1984. He was studying short, repeating stretches of human DNA. The same passage of code printed over and over inside a single gene, like a barcode hidden in the body. He ran an experiment using blood samples from his technician and her parents, none of them aware of what they were participating in. The result was an autoradiograph, an X-ray photograph that shows where a radioactive marker has stuck to the DNA, turning invisible biology into a picture you can hold in your hand. It came out of the developer at 9:05. Jeffreys looked at the black film, white, banding patterns. His first reaction was disappointment. He thought it was a complete mess. He stared at the film for several minutes, and then the penny dropped. He was seeing a pattern of bands different for each family member, inherited directly from parents to child. A multi-locus DNA fingerprint, a pattern so individually specific that no two unrelated people would share it. That evening, in his kitchen, Jeffreys told his wife Sue what he had seen. Sue immediately identified the technique's first practical application, resolving immigration disputes. Alec was already thinking in forensic terms. It was a quiet domestic revelation that would change criminal justice forever. The instrument now had two parents, one who built it and one who aimed it. The instrument that would eventually free Richard Buckland was assembled across 3 peer-reviewed papers, all published in the journal Nature between March and December 1985. The first paper introduced a phrase into the scientific record: an individual-specific DNA fingerprint. The technique was named in the very sentence that announced it. A way to read a pattern from someone's blood that no one else on Earth would share. By July, a second paper established the probabilistic argument. The chance of 2 unrelated people sharing the band pattern was vanishingly small. But neither paper solved the engineering problem separating the laboratory from the field. The method needed fresh blood, and a lot of it. It could not read dried stains. In December 1985, Peter Gill, a research scientist at the government's centralized forensic laboratory, solved the extraction problem. Working with Jeffreys, Gill developed a method for pulling readable DNA from old, dried biological stains. He found a way to pull the attacker's DNA out of a sample that was tangled with the victim's own DNA. 2 signatures on the same stain, finally separated. That paper turned the discovery into a forensic instrument. In principle, every unsolved sexual homicide in the English-speaking world now had an answer waiting in a laboratory. But in practice, no English police force had tested the method. No court had ruled on it. The instrument was complete and in print. Yet no police force on Earth had asked for it. Before the method encountered a criminal investigation, it encountered a family. Jeffreys first used the technique to prove a Ghanaian boy's maternity in an immigration dispute, a sympathetic civil case that produced public support and an unchallenged precedent of acceptance. If the first case had been criminal, the adversarial challenge might have destroyed the method in court. The order mattered. Meanwhile, the Lynda Mann investigation remained a paper case in a filing cabinet. Then, on July 31st, 1986, Dawn Ashworth set out to walk home. She was 15. She took a shortcut along 10-Pound Lane. Dawn Ashworth did not arrive home. Her body was found on August 2nd. The biological evidence was typed using the exact same serological methods used in 1983. The result returned the same profile. Blood Group A, PGM 1+ secretor. The forensic model available to local police confirmed that the same man had almost certainly killed both girls. And it allowed them to know absolutely nothing further about who that man was. They were hunting a ghost hiding inside a population of 2.5 million men. What the model at the University of Leicester could do on that exact day was run both samples through the multi-locus probe and identify the depositor. The method had existed for 23 months. It had been adapted to forensic stains for 8 months. The gap between the model the institution operated with and the model sitting in a laboratory 20 miles north was now at its widest point. 2 girls were dead. The instrument that could have read the killer's molecular signature was sitting in published form, and still, no one had asked. The man who had killed them was watching from the same village, walking the same footpaths, certain he was invisible. A week after the discovery of Dawn Ashworth's body, police brought in a 17-year-old kitchen porter for questioning. Richard Buckland had documented learning difficulties. He had been seen in the area. Under prolonged questioning, he confessed to the Ashworth murder, though he denied the Mann murder. He was charged. The institution rested on an assumption governing English criminal procedure for a century. A confession freely given is strong evidence of guilt. The reformed interview protocols designed to prevent exactly this kind of false confession would not be introduced for another 6 years. Buckland was trapped in the wrong era. What the institutional model could not see was that the real killer's molecular signature was already within reach of the laboratory system. One further detail concentrates this failure into a single brick building. Richard Buckland worked as a kitchen porter at the Carlton Hayes Psychiatric Hospital. Colin Pitchfork, the man who had actually committed both murders, had been referred to that exact same hospital for therapy years prior. The institution that housed the false confessor as an employee had earlier treated the actual killer as a patient. The wrong man was in the kitchen. The right man's file was in the cabinet upstairs. The gap was a matter of knowledge, not will. 20 miles north, the laboratory was quiet. The instrument that would eventually tell the police which case was true existed in Leicester, fully functional, documented, and waiting. The science had matured. The papers were printed. The mathematics were sound. The only thing missing was a connection between the men holding the evidence and the men holding the method. 20 miles from the station processing a false confession, a telephone had not yet rung. Detective Chief Superintendent David Baker was the senior officer on the linked investigations. He read an article in the local press about Alec Jeffreys' work at the university. The coverage focused on the immigration case, but Baker saw the implication for criminal identification. He knew they had a serial killer in their area. The blood grouping told them nothing more than that the same man had probably killed both girls. They needed something more. The institution finally looked outside its own walls. Baker picked up the telephone and called the scientist. By mid-September 1986, Baker proposed that Jeffreys test Buckland against the two crime scene depositors. They were the first police force in the world to take a sample to a scientist and ask for an individual molecular match. They were not even certain what they were asking for. Jeffreys had to explain it to them. This is the exact moment the 26-month gap becomes audible. The institution had not known to ask. Now it had asked. But the telephone call was not the answer. It was only the beginning of the answer. Jeffreys received the samples. He ran the multi-locus probe on the depositor sample from Dawn Ashworth's body, on the depositor sample from Lynda Mann's body, and on a fresh blood sample from Richard Buckland. He processed the biological material through the same method he had invented 2 years prior. The autoradiograph came out of the developer. It returned 3 distinct band patterns on a single piece of X-ray film. The lines that would rewrite forensic history were finally visible to the naked eye. The first finding was absolute. The pattern from the Mann sample and the pattern from the Ashworth sample were identical. The same man had killed both girls. The second finding was devastating to the police case. The pattern from Richard Buckland's blood did not match either crime scene profile. Buckland was not the depositor. He had not killed Dawn Ashworth. He had not killed Lynda Mann. His confession was entirely false. On November 21st, 1986, 3 years to the day after Lynda Mann did not come home, Buckland was released. Nowhere in the history of criminal justice had a new scientific method pulled a confessed innocent out of custody before the actual perpetrator was identified. The exoneration came first. The conviction would have to wait. Richard Buckland walked out of police custody after more than 3 months held for crimes he did not commit. He gave no press interviews after his release. He did not seek the spotlight. The dignity of his silence remains a permanent part of the historical record. The police were back to square one. The killer was still free, walking the same footpaths, operating under the assumption that he was invisible. But he was no longer invisible. The science had seen his face. Now they had to find his name. Leicestershire Constabulary initiated a mass screening. Every adult male resident in the area was invited to give a blood sample. In a village where neighbors noticed who showed up, the word voluntary was meaningless. It was compelled by social visibility. Colin Pitchfork, a 27-year-old baker with a prior history of offences, received the letter. On January 29, 1987, a bakery colleague named Ian Kelly gave a blood sample using a fake passport carrying Pitchfork's details. Pitchfork had paid him £200. The molecular model was flawless. The model that failed was the assumption that photographic identification at a testing centre could not be circumvented. The science was not the weak link. The identity verification procedure was. On a Saturday in August 1987, Ian Kelly was overheard discussing the substitution arrangement during the lunchtime trade at a public house in central Leicester. 6 weeks later, a colleague contacted the police. The day after that call, Pitchfork was arrested at his home. His blood matched both crime scene profiles. He confessed, but this time the confession was merely corroboration. The molecular evidence was the spine. The instrument that closed the case had been bypassed by a fake passport and rescued by a pub conversation. On Friday, January 22nd, 1988, Colin Pitchfork stood before the Crown Court at Leicester. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of rape, and conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 30 years. The DNA evidence was accepted in a guilty plea hearing, establishing a precedent of admissibility in English criminal law. The legal machinery had finally caught up with the scientific reality. 3 months earlier, a parallel precedent had been set in the United States. In less than 90 days, trans-jurisdictional acceptance of the underlying method was permanently established. And then, the instrument began its retirement. By 1990, simpler probes, reading one site at a time instead of many, had replaced the original method in casework. By the mid-90s, a new technique called the polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, had taken over. PCR copies tiny amounts of DNA millions of times until there is enough to read, like turning a whisper into a shout. The new system needed 1,000 times less material. It tolerated severe damage. It could be amplified from samples the original probe could never have read. The revolution had moved on to its next phase. The apparatus that freed Richard Buckland and convicted Colin Pitchfork had a working life of about a decade. The technology moved faster than the justice system could comprehend. Colin Pitchfork's minimum term was 30 years, 3 times longer than the operational life of the scientific instrument that named him. The physical apparatus was retired, packed away in laboratory storage. But the population genetics argument that Jeffreys laid out in the journal Nature in July 1985 survived the retirement of the machine. The argument outlived the instrument. The mathematics were still running, quietly underpinning every DNA exoneration and conviction that followed. The machine was temporary. The math was not. Yet the descendant of that instrument carries its own known limit. Decades later, a man named Lucas Anderson spent 5 months in custody for a murder he did not commit, because his DNA had been picked up by paramedics on a piece of shared equipment and carried, unseen, to a crime scene across town. A trace of skin from one ambulance call had jumped, on a single piece of medical gear, into a homicide it had no part in. The modern method is sensitive enough to read that ghost, and under the wrong conditions, sensitive enough to convict it. The newer instrument is infinitely more sensitive, and therefore more vulnerable to a completely different kind of error. The trade-off is real, and the cost has names. The institution that extracted a false confession from a vulnerable 17-year-old was not malicious. It was operating with the forensic model it believed existed. That model was 20 miles and 26 months behind the model, sitting in a Leicester laboratory. The science had arrived on September 10th, 1984. The institution finally asked on September 18th, 1986. The gap was 26 months, 2 girls, and 1 false confession. The template established in that village is still in use today. But as the science evolved from reading crime scene bloodstains to mapping our entire genetic code, it created a new vulnerability. The instrument that caught Colin Pitchfork is now powerful enough to track anyone. Which leaves us with a question that 1986 never answered. Who exactly owns your biological blueprint?